My son told me to eat in the garage because his business guests were coming over. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. If anything, he sounded embarrassed. "Dad," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "it's only for tonight. These clients are important. I just don't want things to feel awkward." I stood there holding a serving bowl filled with roasted potatoes. For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking. Then I looked at his face. He wasn't behind him. His wife, Melissa, avoided looking at me altogether. She busied herself arranging wine glasses on the dining table, as if she hadn't heard a single word. The smell of rosemary chicken still filled the kitchen. I'd been cooking since noon, not because anyone had asked me to, because cooking for my family had always made me feel useful. "I'm sorry," Daniel added quietly. "They expect a certain atmosphere. A certain atmosphere." I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded. "Of course," I said. "It's no trouble." He looked relieved. That hurt more than the words themselves. "My name is Thomas Walker. I'm 72 years old. For nearly 40 years, I worked as a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon. I wasn't rich. I never expected to be. My wife, Eleanor, used to joke that I could stretch $1 farther than anyone she'd ever met. She'd been gone for almost 6 years now. Cancer. Even after all this time, I still caught myself reaching for the second coffee mug some mornings before remembering I lived alone, or at least I used to. 2 years earlier, Daniel had convinced me to sell my little house after my knees started making the stairs more difficult. "You shouldn't be by yourself anymore," he'd said. "We've got plenty of room." It sounded reasonable. He and Melissa had 2 children. Emma was 15, Ben had just turned 11. The basement had been remodeled into a comfortable suite. "It'll feel like home," Daniel promised for a while. It actually did. The grandchildren were the brightest part of my days. Emma loved listening to stories about old Oregon. Ben always wanted help with his history homework. Some afternoons we'd sit on the back porch eating peanut butter cookies, while he asked questions that somehow wandered from Abraham Lincoln to dinosaurs. Children have a wonderful way of believing every conversation belongs together. I liked that. It reminded me of the classroom. I wasn't raising them. I wasn't replacing their parents. I simply tried to be there whenever they needed another adult willing to listen. At least, that's what I thought. Daniel's business had grown quickly over the past year. He owned a small architectural design firm. Most of his clients were developers with more money than patience. Dinner meetings became more frequent. The house became quieter whenever one was scheduled. Melissa polished everything twice. The children were told to stay upstairs. Even the dog was sent into the backyard. I noticed these things because older people notice routines. When life slows down, small changes become louder. That afternoon had started like dozens before it. Melissa mentioned they were having guests. I offered to help. She hesitated, then smiled politely. "If you wouldn't mind making your roast chicken, it's always better than mine." I laughed. "Now you're just flattering an old teacher." She smiled back. Looking back now, I keep wondering whether she already knew what Daniel planned to ask me later. I honestly don't know. By 6 o'clock, the dining room looked beautiful. Fresh flowers, white candles, crystal glasses. The table reminded me of the anniversary dinners Eleanor used to organize every spring. I straightened one of the napkins without thinking. Melissa quietly moved it back. Only an inch, but enough for me to notice. I pretended not to. The doorbell rang. Daniel adjusted his tie. His shoulders immediately became stiffer, more confident, like someone putting on a costume they'd worn many times before. He looked at me, then at the serving bowls, then back at me. "Dad." His voice almost disappeared. "Could you eat out in the garage tonight?" Silence settled between us. The refrigerator hummed softly. Somewhere upstairs, Ben laughed at something on television. I could hear every tiny sound in the house, except my own heartbeat. "I've set up a little table for you," Daniel continued. "It'll only be for an hour or two. I just don't want my clients getting distracted. Distracted by me." I looked down at my hands, Asian spots, wrinkles, a tiny burn on one finger from pulling the chicken out of the oven. Nothing unusual, just the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime working. I smiled. I understand. Because sometimes the hardest words to say are the kindest ones. The garage was surprisingly clean. Daniel had unfolded an old camping table beside the washing machine. There was even a folding chair, a paper napkin, a glass of iced tea. He had tried to make it comfortable. That somehow made it worse. I sat down. Outside, rain tapped gently against the garage door. Inside the house, laughter floated through the wall. I could hear forks against plates, glasses clinking. Someone complimented the meal. Daniel proudly replied. My wife and I worked on it all afternoon. I looked at the chicken on my plate. It tasted exactly the way Eleanor had taught me to make it 43 years earlier. For the first time since she died, I couldn't finish dinner. I simply sat there, listening, waiting, wondering how a man could spend his entire life trying to raise his son with kindness, only to become someone who needed to be hidden. Then I heard the garage door open. I expected Daniel. Instead, someone else was standing there. The man standing in the garage wasn't my son. He was one of his guests. For a second, we simply stared at each other. He looked to be in his late 50s, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than every suit I'd ever owned combined. Rain dotted the shoulders of his coat, and a leather folder rested under one arm. I'm sorry, he said, glancing around the garage. I was looking for the restroom. I must have opened the wrong door. He paused when he noticed the plate in front of me. Then he looked at the folding table, the camping chair, the washing machine behind me. Confusion crossed his face. I offered a small smile. It happens, I said. The house can be a little confusing. He didn't smile back. Instead, he asked the question I had been trying not to ask myself. Are you eating out here? I hesitated. There are moments in life when telling the truth feels strangely disloyal. I didn't want to embarrass Daniel, not in front of his clients. So I answered carefully. They're having a business dinner inside. The man looked toward the door leading back into the house, then back at me. I see. His voice had become quieter. He knew. I could tell he knew. He didn't press for details. Instead, he extended his hand. My name's Richard. I shook it. Thomas. It's nice to meet you, Thomas. For reasons I couldn't explain, those simple words almost brought tears to my eyes. Sometimes respect isn't shown through grand gestures. Sometimes it's just someone looking you in the eye. Richard glanced at my untouched dinner. That smells incredible. I chuckled softly. I made it. I've been making this recipe for over 40 years. He looked genuinely surprised. I thought your daughter-in-law prepared dinner. I smiled. People assume many things. Silence settled between us again. Not an uncomfortable silence, the kind shared by two strangers who suddenly understand more than either expected. Then voices drifted through the kitchen door. Someone inside called Richard's name. He sighed. I should get back. He took one step toward the door, then stopped. Would you mind if I asked you something? Go ahead. Did you choose to eat out here? The question hung in the air. I could have lied. It would have been easier. Instead, I looked down at my plate. No. It was only one word, but somehow it carried everything I couldn't say. Richard didn't answer. He simply nodded once. Then he walked back into the house. I expected that to be the end of it. I was wrong. Only a few minutes later, the laughter inside changed. Not louder. Quieter, more cautious. Someone asked a question I couldn't quite hear. Then another voice answered. Chairs scraped against the hardwood floor. The easy rhythm of conversation had disappeared. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone. Something had shifted. I told myself it had nothing to do with me. Still, I couldn't stop listening. About 15 minutes later, the garage door opened again. This time it was Emma. She held a small slice of apple pie. Grandpa? I smiled. Shouldn't you be upstairs? She shrugged. I snuck down. She looked around the garage. Her smile faded. Why are you eating here? Children ask questions adults are afraid to ask. I searched for an answer that wouldn't damage the image she had of her father. "It's only for tonight," she frowned. "Did Dad tell you to?" I stayed silent. That was answer enough. Emma looked toward the house, her face tightening in a way I'd never seen before. "That's not right." "No," I said gently. "It probably isn't." She placed the pie in front of me. "I don't want dessert anymore. I think you should have it." "So do I," she smiled faintly. "But I want you to." Before I could say another word, she hugged me. It wasn't a long hug, just a quiet one, the kind that reminds you someone still sees you. Then she hurried back inside before anyone noticed she was gone. I watched the slice of pie sitting beside my untouched dinner. It suddenly became much harder to convince myself that tonight didn't matter because children remember moments adults wish they could erase. And I had a feeling Emma had just witnessed one she would never forget. I finished the slice of pie, not because I was hungry, because Emma had carried it out to me with both hands, as if she were protecting something fragile. Kindness deserves to be accepted, even when your appetite has disappeared. I had just set the empty plate aside, when the voices inside grew louder again. Not shouting, just tense. Someone was speaking in the calm, measured tone people use when they're trying not to embarrass anyone. Then the front door opened. Footsteps crossed the porch. A car engine started. Another followed. The dinner had ended much earlier than Daniel had planned. About 10 minutes later, the kitchen door opened. Daniel stepped into the garage. His tie was loosened now. His shoulders looked heavier than they had an hour earlier. "You can come back inside," he said without meeting my eyes. "The guests have gone." I folded the paper napkin and placed it beside my plate. "Thank you." Neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us until Daniel finally sighed. "I'm sorry. You had to eat out here." There it was, an apology, but it sounded like someone apologizing for bad weather, not for a choice. I smiled gently. "It's all right." "No," he rubbed his forehead. "It isn't." For a moment I thought he might actually explain himself. Instead he said, "You know how business works." I looked at him. "No, Daniel. I know how people work." His expression tightened. "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's true." We walked back into the kitchen together. Melissa was quietly loading the dishwasher. She glanced at us before looking back at the sink. The dining table was nearly cleared. Only one wine glass remained. It still held a few inches of red wine. Daniel noticed me looking at it. "Richard left early." "The client?" He nodded. He said he wasn't feeling well. Something in his voice told me he didn't believe that explanation himself. I carried my plate to the sink. Melissa reached for it. "I'll wash that. I can manage." "No, really." She stopped halfway through the sentence. Her eyes lingered on the plate. Then she whispered so quietly, I almost missed it. "I'm sorry." I looked at her. For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely uncomfortable, not defensive, not annoyed, ashamed. Before I could respond, Daniel spoke from the dining room. "Melissa." She quickly turned away. Whatever she had wanted to say disappeared with that single word. Later that night, I sat in the basement apartment with an old photo album resting on my lap. I wasn't really looking at the pictures. I was remembering the days before photographs became memories. There was one of Daniel at 8 years old, covered in flour, after insisting he wanted to help his mother bake cookies. Another from his high school graduation. He'd hugged me so tightly afterward that my glasses nearly fell off. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." I could still hear those words. People don't become strangers overnight. The distance grows one quiet moment at a time. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. It was Ben. He stood in the doorway wearing dinosaur pajamas. "Grandpa?" "Come in." He climbed onto the couch beside me. "Were you sad tonight?" Children always ask the question adults avoid. I smiled. "A little." He looked down at his hands. "I heard Mom and Dad arguing. I waited. They thought I was asleep." He lowered his voice. "Mom said putting you in the garage was wrong." "That surprised me," Ben continued. "Dad said Richard would have understood if Mom hadn't made it into such a big deal." I frowned. So they disagreed? He nodded. Then he added something that stayed with me long after he went back upstairs. Grandpa, yeah? Why would Dad care more about a man he met 6 months ago than someone who's been his dad forever? I didn't have an answer. Not one a child could understand. Maybe not one I understood myself. The next morning began unusually quietly. Daniel had already left for work before I came upstairs. Melissa was drinking coffee alone at the kitchen island. She looked tired. She set her mug down when she saw me. Thomas, I need to tell you something. I sat across from her. She took a deep breath. After you went into the garage, Richard asked where you were. I felt my stomach tighten. I told him you wanted some quiet. She looked away. He didn't believe me. I didn't speak. He asked who had cooked dinner. When I said you had, he just stared at me. She swallowed hard. Then he asked one question. What did he ask? Melissa's eyes filled with regret. He asked, if this is how you treat the man who raised your husband, how can I trust the way your company treats its people? She looked down at the table. And after that, the entire evening changed. Melissa wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. It had gone cold. Neither of us seemed to notice. I've never seen a room change that quickly, she said, when Richard asked that question. Nobody answered. I pictured the dining room, the polished table, the expensive wine, the carefully chosen words, and then, one honest question. Sometimes that's all it takes. What did Daniel say? I asked. She sighed. He laughed. Not because he thought it was funny, because people sometimes laugh when they don't know what else to do. He said it wasn't what it looked like. I nodded slowly. And was it? Melissa closed her eyes for a moment. No. Then, after a long pause, she whispered. It was exactly what it looked like. She stood and walked to the kitchen window. Rain still clung to the glass. I should have stopped him. I didn't answer. I knew it was wrong. She folded her arms tightly, but I kept thinking. It's just one dinner. Evening, it's just one compromise. She looked back at me. I didn't realize those little compromises change who you become. There wasn't much I could say. Because I had spent a lifetime making little compromises myself, working late instead of taking vacations, skipping new clothes so Daniel could attend summer science camp, selling Eleanor's jewelry after she passed because Daniel needed help with the down payment on this very house. None of those sacrifices had felt large at the time. They were simply what parents did. That afternoon I decided to take a walk. The rain had stopped. The sidewalks still shimmered beneath a pale Oregon sky. I walked farther than usual, past the neighborhood park, past the library, past the small bakery where Eleanor used to insist the cinnamon rolls were worth every calorie. I bought one anyway. Old habits are difficult to lose. As I sat on a bench outside, an elderly man smiled at me. Beautiful morning. It is now, I replied. He nodded as if he understood something I hadn't said. Then we both went back to watching people pass by. There was something comforting about being around strangers. Strangers don't expect you to pretend everything is fine. When I returned home, Daniel's car was already in the driveway. That surprised me. He rarely came home before 6. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard his voice. We've worked together for years. A pause. I understand your concerns. Another pause. No, that's not who we are. His office door was closed. He didn't know I was home. I wasn't trying to listen. But houses have thin walls. I'd appreciate another meeting. Silence, then. I understand. A soft click. The call had ended. A few seconds later, the office door opened. Daniel looked exhausted. His tie had disappeared. His sleeves were rolled up. He looked older than he had yesterday. He noticed me standing in the hallway. We need to talk. We sat across from each other in the living room. For the first time in years, there was no television on in the background, no phones, no distractions. Just the two of us. Daniel leaned forward. Richard cancelled the contract. I said nothing. It was our biggest project this year. He rubbed his hands together. He said our company values didn't match his. He laughed bitterly. Can you believe that? I looked at him carefully. I can. He stared at me. You think I deserved this? I think your decision had consequences. They're unrelated. Are they? His jaw tightened. It was one dinner. No, I spoke calmly. It was one decision. There's a difference. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel asked, "Do you know what Richard said before he left?" I shook my head. He told me. Daniel swallowed hard. Purging character isn't how you treat important clients. He looked toward the dining room. It's how you treat the people who can do nothing for you. The room fell silent again. I could see those words settling inside him. Not changing him. Not yet. Just refusing to leave. That evening, Emma came downstairs carrying an old photo album. I found this in the attic. She placed it on the coffee table. It was my wedding album. I hadn't seen it in years. The cover was worn. The pages smelled faintly of dust. Emma opened it carefully. "There you are." She pointed to a picture of Eleanor laughing during our first dance. Then she pointed to another photograph. A little boy sat on my shoulders, holding a paper flag, Daniel, maybe 5 years old. "Dad?" Emma asked quietly, looking at her father. "Did Grandpa ever make you eat in the garage?" Daniel didn't answer. Emma wasn't accusing him. She genuinely wanted to know. Children often search the past to understand the present. Daniel looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he whispered, "No." Emma tilted her head. "Then, why did you do it to him?" No one in the room had an answer, and somehow that question hurt more than losing any business contract ever could. Emma's question stayed in the room long after she had gone upstairs. "Then, why did you do it to him?" Daniel never answered. He simply closed the photo album and carried it back to the shelf. That was how my son dealt with uncomfortable feelings. He organized them, put them away, hoped they wouldn't find their way back. Unfortunately, some memories don't stay on shelves. The next few days settled into an uneasy routine. Daniel left for work before sunrise. He came home after dark. Dinner became quieter. Melissa tried harder than usual to include me in conversations. Ben kept asking if I wanted to play chess after school. Only Emma seemed different. She watched everyone, not suspiciously, carefully, as though she were trying to understand how adults could love each other and still hurt each other. At 15, she was beginning to notice the difference between intentions and choices. Friday afternoon, I was trimming the rose bushes in the backyard when Melissa stepped outside. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, one for herself, one for me. "I thought you might need a break." I smiled. "Thank you." We sat on the old wooden bench Eleanor and I had bought nearly 20 years earlier. The wood had faded. The screws squeaked. Neither of us minded. Melissa stared into her mug. "I owe you the truth." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." She drew a slow breath. The garage wasn't Daniel's first idea. That surprised me. "What do you mean?" "He originally wanted you to stay at your friend Harold's house for the evening." I blinked. "He wanted me to leave my own home?" She nodded. When I refused, he said, "Maybe you could just eat downstairs." She looked down at the grass. The garage was our compromise. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Not because I was angry, because I was trying to understand how many conversations had happened without me. How many decisions about my life had been made while I wasn't in the room. "I should have told you," Melissa whispered. I kept convincing myself we'd never actually go through with it. She looked genuinely ashamed. I didn't recognize Daniel anymore. I thought about that. People often imagine change arrives like a storm. It usually arrives like dust, a little at a time, so slowly that nobody notices until everything is covered. That evening, my phone rang. The caller ID surprised me. Richard Collins. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Hello, Thomas? It's Richard." "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." His voice sounded hesitant. "I've been thinking about our conversation." I smiled faintly. "We didn't have much of one." "No. But I think we should." He asked if I'd be willing to meet him for coffee the following morning. "Just coffee," he said. "I'd like to apologize." I frowned. "For what?" For walking back into that dining room. I should have walked back out with you. His words caught me off guard. You had no obligation. I know. But I've spent 30 years building a company. I tell my employees that integrity matters. He paused. If I ignore something like that because it isn't happening to me, then those words don't mean much. The cafe was quiet the next morning. Richard was already there when I arrived. He stood as I approached, not out of formality, out of respect. It reminded me of my students who had been raised to stand when an older teacher entered the room. Small gestures, big meaning. Over coffee, he surprised me again. My father died when I was 26. He stirred his tea slowly. We argued the week before. I stayed quiet. I kept postponing lunch with him because I was trying to grow my business. His eyes rested on the window. I thought there would always be another weekend. There wasn't. I knew that feeling. Regret has a way of becoming part of your voice. Richard smiled sadly. When I saw you sitting alone in that garage, I didn't just see you. I saw the conversation I never got to have with my own father. Neither of us spoke for a while. Sometimes silence honors a memory better than words. Before we left, Richard reached into his briefcase. I'd like to ask you something. He slid a folded brochure across the table. It wasn't a business contract. It wasn't a check. It was an invitation. At the top were the words, Volunteer Mentor Program, Portland Public Schools. They're looking for retired teachers. They help students who need extra support. He smiled. I have a feeling you'd be very good at it. I looked at the brochure for several seconds. I hadn't stood in a classroom in almost 10 years. Part of me thought that chapter of my life was over. Another part wasn't so sure. As I folded the brochure and slipped it into my jacket pocket, I had no idea that accepting or refusing that invitation would change far more than my own future. It would force Daniel to confront something no business failure ever could. I left the cafe with the brochure tucked inside my jacket. It wasn't heavy. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. For years, I'd told myself that retirement meant slowing down, finding smaller routines. Staying out of the way. Somewhere along the line, I had mistaken being quiet for no longer being needed. The following Monday, I visited the school district's mentoring office. The building smelled exactly the way schools always do. Fresh paper flour, polish, coffee that had been sitting on a warmer too long. I smiled before I even reached the reception desk. Some memories don't need photographs. A familiar smell is enough. A young receptionist greeted me. You must be Mr. Walker. I blinked. You were expecting me. She laughed. Mr. Collins called Friday afternoon. He said we'd be lucky if you agreed to come. I shook my head. He's giving me too much credit. Maybe, she said with a grin. But he sounded very certain. An hour later, I met the program coordinator, a woman named Karen. She explained that many students simply needed someone to listen. Some struggled with reading. Some had lost a parent. Others had no adult at home with enough time to help them. We're not asking you to save anyone, Karen said. We're asking you to show up. Such a simple sentence, yet it reminded me that the most important people in my life had rarely solved my problems. They had simply stayed. Before leaving, Karen asked one last question. When could you start? I surprised myself. Tomorrow. That evening I came home carrying a folder of volunteer paperwork. Ben spotted it first. Grandpa, did you get a new job? I laughed. Not exactly. Emma looked up from the dining table. What is it? I'm going to help students after school. Her face lit up. That's perfect. I know. She said it so confidently that I couldn't help smiling. Daniel walked in just as Emma said those words. What's perfect? Emma answered before I could. Grandpa's teaching again. Daniel froze. Teaching? Volunteering, I corrected. Just a few afternoons each week. He nodded slowly. That's nice. But something about his expression changed. Not jealousy, not annoyance. Something closer to uncertainty. The next afternoon was my first day. My student was a 12-year-old boy named Marcus. He barely looked at me. Karen quietly explained that he'd transferred schools twice in 1 year. His grades had slipped. He rarely spoke in class. For the first 20 minutes, neither of us said much. We simply worked through a history worksheet together. Then I noticed he kept erasing the same answer. "You're allowed to make mistakes," I said. He shrugged. "My dad says mistakes make people weak." I looked at the pencil in his hand. The eraser was almost gone. "No," I said gently. "Refusing to learn from mistakes makes people weak." He looked at me for the first time. Really looked then, almost shyly. He smiled. It wasn't much, but it felt like the beginning of something. Weeks passed. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons became my favorite part of the week. Marcus slowly began talking about school, about basketball, about how much he missed his older sister after she moved away for college. He was a good kid. He simply needed someone willing to listen without rushing him. Funny enough, so did I. At home, things remained polite, but not easy. Daniel and I rarely argued. We also rarely talked. He buried himself in work. I buried myself in mentoring. We had become two men living under the same roof, carefully walking around a conversation neither of us knew how to begin. One Friday evening, as we were finishing dinner, Daniel cleared his throat. "I have some news." Melissa looked at him but didn't speak. My company lost another client. Emma quietly set down her fork. "This one had nothing to do with Richard," Daniel added quickly. "No?" I asked. He hesitated. "They said they were going in a different direction." I nodded. Business changes, it happens. But Daniel didn't seem convinced by his own explanation. He pushed his plate away. "I've been thinking." No one interrupted. "I've spent years trying to build a reputation." He looked down at his hands. "And now, I'm not even sure what that reputation is." For the first time since the garage dinner, I saw something I hadn't seen in my son. Not guilt, not yet, self-doubt, and sometimes that is where real change quietly begins. October arrived quietly. The maple tree in the front turned a deep shade of red. Every morning I swept leaves from the walkway. Every afternoon, more appeared. Life has a funny way of reminding us that some work is never really finished. You simply keep showing up. Marcus was changing. His teachers noticed it before he did. He started raising his hand in class. His history grades climbed from a C- to a solid B. One Tuesday he handed me a folded piece of notebook paper before I left. I wrote something. I unfolded it after I reached my car. It wasn't an essay. It was one sentence. "Thanks for waiting when everyone else seemed busy." I sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes. No award I had received during 40 years of teaching had ever meant more. That evening, I pinned the note to the bulletin board in my basement apartment, right beside an old photograph of Eleanor. "I think you'd like him," I said aloud. Talking to photographs might seem strange, but after 50 years of marriage, some conversations don't really end. They simply change addresses. A few days later, Daniel knocked on my door. Not the quick tap people use before walking in. A real knock. Respectful. "Come in." He stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. For a moment I almost smiled. It had been years since he'd made coffee for anyone but himself. I thought we could talk. I motioned toward the couch. We probably should. Neither of us touched the coffee. Daniel looked around the room instead. His eyes settled on the bulletin board. He noticed Marcus's note. "Who's that from?" "A student. You really enjoy mentoring, don't you?" "I do." He nodded slowly. "I haven't seen you this happy in a long time." I laughed quietly. I didn't realize I wasn't. Daniel leaned forward. "I've been thinking about that night." I stayed silent. "I keep replaying it." His voice was steady, not defensive, not rehearsed. I told myself I was protecting my business. He looked down at his hands. "But that's not the whole truth." I waited. I was embarrassed. The words barely escaped his mouth. "I hate admitting that. I worried my clients would see an old man walking with a cane and think our home wasn't polished enough." He closed his eyes. I reduced my own father to part of the furniture. The room became very still. "I've asked myself where that came from," he continued. "I think," he paused, "I spent so many years trying to prove I belonged in rooms with successful people, that I forgot who taught me how to walk into a room in the first place. I looked at him carefully. His eyes were wet, not dramatically, just enough to tell me this wasn't easy. "I'm sorry, Dad." There it was, the apology, Siebel, no excuses attached to it, no if no, but, just the truth. I believed he meant it, but belief and healing are not the same thing. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. He looked relieved, then I added quietly, "I've already forgiven you." His shoulders relaxed. "But," they tensed again, "forgiveness doesn't erase what happened." He nodded. "I know, trust grows the same way it breaks." Slowly, neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Daniel asked, "What do I do now?" It was an honest question, not, "How do I make you stop being upset?" Not, "How do I fix this today?" Simply, "What do I do now?" I smiled faintly. "You stop worrying about one dinner and start paying attention to every dinner after it." He frowned slightly. "I don't understand. You don't rebuild a relationship with one apology. You rebuild it through ordinary Tuesdays, Saturday breakfasts, phone calls, listening, keeping promises, the little things. Because the little things are what broke us." Daniel looked around the basement apartment again. His eyes stopped on the small bookshelf Eleanor had built for me decades earlier. I never realized how little time I've spent down here. He wasn't talking about the room. He was talking about my life. As he stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Dad?" "Yes." "Next Thursday." I was thinking we could have dinner. I smiled. "We have dinner every Thursday." He shook his head. "No, I mean," he swallowed, "just us. No business, no phones, I'll cook." For the first time in months, I saw my son trying not to repair the past, but to earn a better future. And somehow, that mattered far more. The following Thursday arrived sooner than I expected. All week, Daniel said almost nothing about it. No reminders, no speeches, no promises. Just one simple sentence on Wednesday evening. "I'll be home early tomorrow." That was all. Sometimes the people who are truly trying to change stop announcing it. They simply begin living differently. At 4 o'clock Thursday afternoon, I returned from mentoring Marcus. As I walked through the front door, something immediately caught my attention. The kitchen smelled like burnt garlic. I smiled. Daniel was cooking, or at least trying to. I found him standing over a skillet, wearing one of Melissa's aprons. It looked ridiculous on him. He looked up and laughed. "I think I may have already ruined dinner." I walked over and peered into the pan. "No, you've only scared it." He laughed harder than I had heard him laugh in months. Melissa leaned against the counter with a glass of iced tea. "I'm under strict orders not to help." "Good," I said. "He'll never learn otherwise." Daniel rolled his eyes. "I suddenly remember why I hated cooking lessons." "You didn't hate them," I replied. "You hated cleaning afterward." He stopped stirring. "You remember that?" I smiled. "I remember everything." For the next hour, we worked side by side. Not father and son trying to fix the past. Just two men chopping vegetables, arguing about whether onions should be sliced thin or thick, lawing when Daniel nearly dropped an entire bowl of mushrooms onto the floor. Ben wandered in. "Whoa, is Dad actually cooking?" Emma looked over his shoulder. "We should probably order pizza just in case." Daniel pretended to be offended. "I have confidence." Emma grinned. "We don't." The table looked different that evening. Not because of expensive dishes, not because of candles, because everyone sat down together. Nobody was missing. Nobody had been moved somewhere more convenient. Nobody had been hidden. Daniel waited until everyone had filled their plates. Then he stood. "I want to say something." Melissa reached over and squeezed his hand. He looked at me. "Not long ago, I made the worst decision of my adult life." The room became quiet. I thought appearances mattered more than people. They don't. "I hurt someone who spent his entire life putting me first." His voice cracked. "And I can't change that night, but I can make sure there isn't another one." He looked directly at me. "I'm sorry. In front of everyone, because I embarrassed you in front of no one." And somehow, That was even worse. I looked around the table. Emma watched her father with tears in her eyes. Ben didn't fully understand everything that had happened, but he understood enough. Children always do. I raised my glass. Then let's eat. Everyone laughed. The tension broke. Conversation slowly returned. For the first time in months, the house felt like a home again. Halfway through dinner, Ben pointed at the roasted chicken. "This tastes different." Daniel looked worried. "Bad different." Ben took another bite. "No, it tastes like Grandpa's." Daniel smiled. "Because he'd taught me." I hadn't. Not really. He'd simply watched me enough as a child to remember. Funny how love leaves instructions inside us, even when we forget we learned them. After dessert, Emma disappeared upstairs. She returned carrying a framed photograph. It was an old picture of our family at the Oregon coast. Eleanor stood in the middle, laughing as the wind blew her hair across her face. Daniel was 16. I had one arm around him, the other around my wife. Emma placed the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. "I think Grandma belongs back in the living room." Melissa smiled. "I think so too. I hadn't realized someone had moved it years earlier."
Seeing Eleanor there again, watching over all of us, made the room feel complete.
Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone on the back porch. The autumn air was cool, the neighborhood was quiet. I heard the sliding door open behind me. Daniel stepped outside carrying 2 blankets. Without saying a word, he draped one across my shoulders. It was exactly what Eleanor used to do. He sat beside me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked, "Do you think Mum would have forgiven me?" I looked up at the stars, then I smiled. She would have been disappointed. He lowered his head. "I know, but she also would have reminded you that being ashamed isn't the same as becoming better." He looked at me. "So, what matters now is who you choose to be tomorrow." He nodded slowly. "I'd like to make her proud." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then don't do it for her." He frowned. "Do it because it's the right thing." We sat there together in comfortable silence. Neither of us realized that, inside the house, a phone was about to ring, and the person calling would bring news that neither of us expected. News that would test whether Daniel's change was real, or only temporary. The phone rang just after 10. Daniel and I were still sitting on the back porch when we heard it through the kitchen window. Melissa answered first. A few seconds later, her voice changed. "Daniel." He stood immediately. "Who is it?" She looked toward us, her hand still covering the phone. "It's Richard." Daniel and I exchanged a glance. He took the phone. "Hello?" I couldn't hear Richard's words, but I could see them landing. Daniel's shoulders stiffened, then relaxed, then stiffened again.
"Tomorrow morning?"
A pause. Yes, I understand." Another pause. "Thank you." He hung up slowly. No one spoke. Finally, Melissa asked, "What did he say?" Daniel looked at me before answering. "He wants to meet." The next morning, Daniel left before sunrise. I tried to keep myself busy. I watered the plants, read half a newspaper, organized a drawer that didn't need organizing. By noon, I was making tea when the front door opened. Daniel walked in, carrying his briefcase. He looked exhausted, but not defeated. "How did it go?" Melissa asked. He set the briefcase down carefully. "Richard offered us another chance." Melissa's eyes widened. "What?" He said he spent the past month watching how I handled losing the contract. Daniel looked at me. He spoke with former employees, with other clients, even with our office manager. I frowned. "Why?" "Because he wanted to know whether that night in our house was an exception, or a reflection of who I really was." Daniel sat at the kitchen table. His hands trembled slightly. "He told me something this morning." "I waited," he said. "The garage wasn't the reason I cancelled the contract." Daniel swallowed hard. "The garage was the reason I started paying attention." The room fell silent. "What happened after that?" I asked. Daniel rubbed his forehead. He said he noticed things he'd ignored before. Employees afraid to disagree with me. Long hours, high turnover. People thanking me for basic respect. He gave a humorless laugh. I thought that meant I was a good boss. He looked down. Richard said truly respected leaders don't create workplaces where basic decency feels like a gift. Melissa sat beside him. So, did he give you the contract back? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, but with one condition. What condition? He wants our company to create a mentorship program for junior employees. He said businesses don't just build projects. They build people. I couldn't help smiling. Sounds familiar. Daniel looked at me. He said he learned it from an old teacher. That afternoon, Daniel came downstairs to my apartment carrying a cardboard box. I found these in the attic. Inside were dozens of items from my teaching years, student letters, retirement plaques, newspaper, clippings, old lesson plans. One envelope caught my attention. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. I opened it carefully. Inside was a note she had written shortly before my retirement. Thomas, you think your career was about history, but it was really about people. Long after students forget dates and wars, they'll remember how you made them feel when they thought they weren't smart enough. Don't ever believe that gift disappears just because a school district gives you a retirement cake. I read the note twice, then a third time. My vision blurred slightly. Daniel watched quietly. I've never seen that before, he said. I folded the letter with trembling hands. Neither have I. That evening, I drove to Marcus's school for our mentoring session. He was waiting with a grin. I got an A on my history test. That's wonderful. He shrugged, trying to act unimpressed. My teacher, said I, explained the causes of the Civil War better than anyone in class. I laughed. Careful. Keep that up and they'll make you a history teacher. He looked horrified. Please no. We both laughed. Then he grew serious. My dad came to my game yesterday. Really? He hasn't been to one in months. Marcus looked down at his backpack. I think he's trying. I thought about Daniel. About apologies. About awkward dinners. About second chances. Sometimes people don't transform overnight. Sometimes they simply decide to try again tomorrow. And then the next day. And the next. When I returned home that night, I found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table alone. He looked up. Can I ask you something? Of course. He hesitated. Do you think people can really change? I sat across from him. I think people can choose differently. Every day. He nodded slowly. That's less dramatic than I expected. Real change usually is. I smiled. It's not a lightning strike, it's a habit. He looked thoughtful, then he reached for 2 coffee mugs. Tea? He asked. I smiled. Only if you don't burn the garlic again. For the first time in a very long time, my son laughed without any shadow behind it. People often imagine forgiveness as a single conversation. It isn't. Forgiveness happens in small moments that don't seem important at the time. A cup of coffee left outside your door, a ride to the grocery store. A simple question asked, because someone genuinely wants to know the answer. Those were the moments that slowly began changing my son. The Monday after our conversation in the basement, Daniel knocked on my door just after 7. Dad? I looked up from the newspaper. Morning. I'm driving past your school. He hesitated. I thought, maybe you'd like a ride. For a second, I almost said no, old habits are hard to break. I'd grown used to handling things on my own. Then I remembered what I'd told him. Trust grows slowly. That meant allowing someone the chance to earn it. I'd like that. The smile on his face reminded me of the little boy who used to celebrate every small victory. The drive to the school lasted only 15 minutes. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel. Neither of us felt the need to fill every silence. Comfort doesn't always sound like conversation. Sometimes it sounds like 2 people finally relaxing around each other again. As he pulled into the parking lot, he cleared his throat. What are you teaching today? I smiled. I'm not teaching. I'm listening. He looked puzzled. I thought mentoring meant giving advice. It mostly means giving attention. He thought about that all the way home. A week later, Daniel surprised me again. I came upstairs expecting an empty kitchen. Instead, he was standing at the counter wearing another apron. This time nothing was burning. I watched 3 cooking videos, he said proudly. I can tell. How? The smoke alarm isn't going off, he laughed. So, progress. Definite progress. Melissa rolled her eyes from across the room. You two sound exactly alike. Emma smiled without looking up from her homework. That's because Grandpa's rubbing off on him again. Daniel didn't argue. He simply smiled. Friday evening became family game night. No clients, no laptops, no business calls. Ben insisted everyone play Monopoly. Melissa complained it took too long. Emma said that was the point. 3 hours later, Ben declared himself the richest man in Oregon. Daniel accused him of cheating. Ben looked offended. I learned from YouTube. We all laughed. The house hadn't sounded like that in a very long time. At work, Daniel began making changes no one had asked him to make. He stopped scheduling meetings during dinner hours. He started asking the youngest architects for their opinions before making decisions. When someone stayed late at the office, he stayed with them instead of going home early. One afternoon, his office manager quietly asked, "Everything okay?" Daniel smiled.
I'm finally learning what leadership actually looks like.
A few days later, Marcus handed me another note. This one was longer. Mr. Walker, I used to think grown-ups only noticed kids when they messed up. You noticed me before I did anything special. That made me want to become someone special. Thank you. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. That evening, Daniel noticed it. Another letter? I nodded. He asked if he could read it. After a minute, he handed it back. His eyes had grown quiet. I don't think I ever thanked you. For what? For noticing me. I looked at my son. You never had to. He shook his head. Maybe I did. That night, before everyone went to bed, Daniel stopped me in the hallway. Dad, yes. I've been thinking about something. What is it? The last time I invited people into this house, I was worried they'd judge me because of you. His voice cracked. This time, he looked around at the laughter still echoing from the living room. I think I'd be proud if they met you. For the first time since that terrible night, I believed him. Not because of what he said, because of everything he had quietly done before saying it. Winter came and went. Spring arrived quietly. The maple tree in the front yard, once bare and brittle, was covered in fresh green leaves again. I had always liked spring. It reminded me that change rarely happens all at once. It happens one morning at a time. 6 months had passed since the night I ate dinner in the garage. Some memories had faded. That one hadn't. Not because anyone mentioned it, because none of us needed to. It had become part of our family's story. Not the chapter that defined us, but the one that changed us. Daniel had changed in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. He came home before dinner more often than not. His phone stayed in his pocket during meals. When Ben talked about school, Daniel actually listened instead of answering emails. When Emma discussed colleges, he asked questions instead of checking the clock. Small things. But families are built from small things. One Saturday morning, I found Daniel repairing the old porch swing, the same swing Eleanor and I had bought years earlier. One chain had rusted, a wooden slat had cracked. I was going to replace it, I said. He tightened another bolt. I know. So why fix it? He smiled without looking up. Because not everything old needs replacing. For a moment, neither of us said a word. I wasn't sure he realized what he'd actually said. But I did at the mentoring program. Marcus had become a different young man. His grades continued improving. More importantly, he had started believing he belonged. On my birthday, he handed me a small gift bag. Inside was a coffee mug. Printed across the front were the words, "Wound's best teacher." He laughed. "I retired years ago." Marcus grinned. "Not from my class." Some gifts cost very little, yet become priceless. That evening, I placed the mug beside Eleanor's photograph. I could almost hear her teasing me. "Don't let it go to your head, Thomas." I smiled. It already has. The following Tuesday, Daniel came home carrying a folder. He looked nervous. Not the nervousness of someone expecting failure, the nervousness of someone hoping not to disappoint. "Dad, I have something to tell you. I set my book aside. What is it? Our company was invited to compete for the Riverfront Development Project. I recognized the name immediately. It was one of the largest architectural projects in the state. If we win it, it'll change the company. I nodded. Congratulations, he smiled.
Thank you.
Then he added,
The final presentation isn't at the office.
It's here. I frowned. Here? They want to see how we work together outside the boardroom. I could already see where his thoughts were going. He noticed the expression on my face. No, he said it gently. I know what you're thinking. This isn't like last time. A week later, the house filled with quiet preparation. Melissa arranged flowers on the dining table. Ben vacuumed the living room without being asked. Emma baked a lemon cake she'd learned from her grandmother's old recipe book. Daniel checked everything twice, then a third time. Not because he was chasing perfection, because he wanted everyone to feel welcome. There was a difference now, a very important one. Late that afternoon, I walked into the kitchen. Dad, Daniel called. Can I ask your opinion? At the table. He nodded. I can't decide where everyone should sit. I smiled. Does it matter? I think it does. I studied the chairs for a moment, then shrugged. I suppose you'll sit at one end. Melissa at the other, the children along the sides. He remained unusually quiet. Finally, he shook his head. No. What do you mean? He walked slowly toward the chair at the head of the table, the very chair he had always occupied whenever guests came over. Without saying a word, he pulled it out, then looked at me. I was hoping you'd sit here. I stared at him, certain I'd misunderstood. He smiled. This house has had the wrong person at the head of the table for a long time. I felt my throat tighten. Daniel, he interrupted gently. Please. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. The guests had arrived, and among them was Richard Collins once again. For a moment, neither of us moved. The doorbell rang again, then a third time. Guests were gathering on the front porch. Still, Daniel kept his hand resting on the chair at the head of the table, waiting, not speaking, just waiting. I looked at the chair, then at my son. I don't belong there. He smiled gently. You've belonged there my whole life. Melissa opened the front door. Warm greetings filled the hallway. Coats were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Lotta drifted into the living room. Ben hurried forward, volunteering to take everyone's umbrellas. Emma welcomed each guest as though she'd been hosting dinners for years. The house felt different, not because of the people inside, because no one was pretending to be someone they weren't. Richard Collins was the last to enter. The moment he saw me, his face brightened. Thomas, it's good to see you again. It's good to see you too. He shook my hand warmly. Then his eyes wandered toward the dining room. He noticed the table. He noticed the chair waiting at its head, and then he looked at Daniel. Neither man said a word, neither needed to. Dinner wasn't served immediately. People gathered in small groups, talking over coffee and appetizers. One guest admired the old family photographs lining the hallway. Another stopped in front of Eleanor's portrait. What a wonderful smile. I couldn't help smiling myself. She made every room brighter. I believe it. Richard wandered toward the bookshelf in the living room. He picked up one of my old teaching awards, 40 years of outstanding service. He looked at Daniel. You never mentioned your father was a teacher. Daniel smiled. I should have. He taught history. Then, after a brief pause, he added, he also taught me almost everything worth knowing. I felt my chest tighten. Those words weren't spoken for my benefit. They were simply true. And somehow, that made them even more meaningful. When dinner was ready, everyone moved toward the table. Out of habit, I quietly stepped toward one of the side chairs, the one I usually chose. Before I could sit, Daniel spoke. Dad. The room grew still. He walked to the head of the table and placed one hand on the chair. I think you're sitting in the wrong place. I smiled awkwardly. I'm perfectly comfortable here. I know. He shook his head. But tonight isn't about comfort. He gently pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Then he looked directly at me. His voice was calm, but everyone could hear it. "Dad, the head of this table belongs to you." Silence filled the room, the kind that carries emotion instead of discomfort. I spent too much time worrying about what strangers would think. I forgot the only opinion that should have mattered. He swallowed hard. "I'm done making that mistake." I couldn't move. For the first time in months, words failed me. Daniel smiled softly. "Please." It wasn't a request born from guilt. It was an invitation born from respect. Slowly, I walked toward the chair. Daniel waited until I sat down. Only then did he take his own seat. Not at the head of the table, beside me, exactly where a son should sit. One of the guests looked from Daniel to me. "I didn't realize. This is your father." Daniel smiled with quiet pride. "My father." He paused. "My greatest teacher." No one spoke for several seconds. Then Richard quietly set down his glass. He looked at me first, then at Daniel. "The last time I visited this house, I learned what kind of man your son was." The room became completely silent. Richard smiled. "Tonight, I learned what kind of man he's becoming." No applause followed. No dramatic speeches. Just quiet understanding. Sometimes, those are the moments people remember longest. Dinner continued with easy conversation. Nobody was trying to impress anyone anymore. Ben proudly explained his latest science project. Emma talked excitedly about the university she'd been accepted to. Melissa laughed more than she'd laughed in years. At one point, I caught myself looking around the table. Every chair was filled. No one had been separated. No one had been hidden. For the first time since Eleanor passed away, our family didn't feel like people living in the same house. We felt like a family again. And as I looked at my son, I realized something. The most important seat at the table was never the one at the head. It was the place in someone's heart. And after a long journey, my son had finally made room for me again. People sometimes ask me if I ever forgot the night I ate dinner in the garage. The answer is simple: no, I never forgot it. And I hope I never do, not because I enjoy remembering the hurt, but because forgetting pain too quickly often means forgetting the lesson it came to teach. A few weeks after the dinner with Richard, life quietly returned to normal, or perhaps it became something better than normal. Daniel no longer rushed through breakfast with one eye on his phone. Melissa stopped apologizing for things she hadn't done. Emma left for college that autumn. Before she packed the last box into her car, she hugged me tighter than she ever had before. "You'll visit?" She smiled. "Every chance I get." Then she whispered something only I could hear. "I'm glad Dad found his way back." I watched her drive away. Parents spend years teaching their children. Then one day, their children begin teaching them. Emma had done that for all of us. Ben grew taller almost overnight. He started borrowing my history books. At first, I thought he was trying to impress me. Later, I realized he genuinely enjoyed them. One Saturday afternoon, he asked, "Grandpa, what made you want to become a teacher?" I thought about it for a long moment. Then I answered honestly, "Because someone believed in me before I believed in myself." He nodded. "I think that's what teachers really do." I smiled. "I think you're right." My afternoons at the mentoring program continued. Marcus finished the school year with the highest history grade in his class. When summer vacation began, he handed me one final envelope. Inside was a photograph of the two of us standing outside the school. On the back he had written, "One day I hope someone feels safer because I'm in the room, just like I did because you were in mine." I slipped the picture into my wallet. It has stayed there ever since. Not because I need reminding, because some reminders deserve to travel with us. Daniel's company continued to grow. Ironically, not because he became a better businessman, because he became a better man. Employees stayed longer. Young architects spoke more freely. People laughed in the office again. Richard and Daniel remained friends long after the contracts were signed. Their conversations rarely centered on buildings anymore. More often, they talked about people. One rainy Sunday afternoon, Daniel and I were cleaning the garage. The old camping table still stood folded against the wall. Dust had gathered on its legs. He stared at it for several seconds. Without saying a word, he picked it up, carried it outside, and placed it beside the trash bin. "I don't need this anymore," he said quietly. I looked at the table, then at my son. "No, you don't." That was all either of us needed to say. Some things belong in the past. Not because they never mattered, but because they've finished teaching us. That evening, our family gathered around the dining table once again. No guests, no celebrations, no special occasion, just dinner. Halfway through the meal, Daniel suddenly looked around the table, then he smiled. "You know, I used to think success meant having important people want to eat in my house." He reached over and placed his hand gently on mine. I was wrong. He looked at Melissa, then Ben, the empty chair that would soon hold Emma during her next visit home. Finally, he looked back at me. The important people were already here. No one spoke. No one needed to. Love has a way of making silence feel complete. Now, when I think back to that night in the garage, I don't remember the cold folding chair, or the paper napkin, or even the loneliness. I remember what came after. A granddaughter brave enough to ask the question no adult wanted to answer. A stranger willing to speak when staying silent would have been easier. A son humble enough to admit he had failed. And a family patient enough to rebuild instead of walk away. People often believe dignity is something another person can take from you. I don't anymore. Dignity isn't found in the room where you're asked to eat. It isn't decided by the chair you're given. It lives in the choices you make after you've been hurt, whether you become bitter or become better. As for me, I still sit at the head of the table whenever my family gathers, not because it's my seat, but because every time Daniel pulls out that chair before sitting down himself, he reminds me of something far more valuable than an apology. He reminds me that respect, once lost, can be earned again slowly, pottily, one ordinary dinner at a time. Do you think Daniel truly earned his father's forgiveness? Or would you have made him work harder for it? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoy powerful family stories like this, like the video and subscribe. You won't want to miss the next one.